you had a conversation with Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter, and from there it became clear to me. I think John made clear how important to the conversation about race is policing in today's society. That's where a lot of African Americans feel is sort of the pinnacle of racism sits. The people that believe there's still racism in America. There's still a lot of racism in America. That's where it is. So to what degree do you think there's widespread institutional racism in policing?
Yeah. Well, my first book was a book called Race, Crime, and the Law. And
1997.
1997. Wow.
Time flies.
Time flies. Unfortunately, the impetus behind that book stands. That book was propelled by a sense that with respect to the administration of criminal justice, African Americans feel deeply aggrieved, and they feel deeply aggrieved with good reason. And they feel deeply aggrieved with good reason in at least two dimensions. On the one hand, African Americans suffer from underprotection. And in fact, in that book, the central theme of that book was that Black Americans suffer from underprotection. If you take a look at the broad, the broad trajectory of American history and ask yourself, in what way have Black Americans been most oppressed? Well, take a look at the antebellum period before the abolition of slavery. Before the abolition of slavery, in the locales where most Black people resided, namely the slave states, in a lot of those areas, was there a crime called the murder of a Black person? Answer, for a long period, the answer was no. There might have been a tort, so if a white person killed a slave, that person could be sued because they had injured the property of another and would have to pay money for that. But had they committed a crime? Answer, no. In the antebellum period, were Black women protected against the crime of rape? In most states, the answer was no. There was no such crime. Let's go to after. Slavery is abolished. Thank God. Slavery is abolished. Then let's see, what happens. So we hear lynching. But from 1890 until, let's say, 1930. Well, in 1890, there was probably, I would say there was probably on average a lynching every day in the United States. Well over 300 lynchings. It goes down. That was the case in the 1890s, probably the first decade of the 20th century, and then it starts going down. What was lynching about? Lynching was about Black people being executed outside the law. Did the legal system do anything about that? Answer no. You show me cases in which people were prosecuted criminally for engaging in lynching. You come up in most places with a null set. Black people suffered the underprotection of the law. Do Black people still suffer the underprotection of the law? The answer is yes. People talk about the Kerner Commission report, 1968. Black people were asked, with respect to the police, what's your main complaint? In many places, the main complaint was, we don't have police protection. When things happen to us, when our houses are burgled, when our businesses are encroached upon by robbers, when our businesses are robbed, when we're assaulted, nothing happens. The police protect white people. They don't protect us. Underprotection. Our society right now, if you take a look at the statistics, who is most liable to be raped, robbed, the victim of assault, what have you? Black people. I mean, and it's not even close. Underprotection. So that's one way in which the administration of criminal justice harms Black people, by not doing what government is supposed to do, which is protect us. 14th Amendment, equal protection. I underline protection of the law. So that was a big theme of race, crime, and the law. Now, second, and this is the thing that gets most attention, and it's important. I think that the underprotection story does not get enough attention, but then there's a second story. The second story is that Black people have historically and still today, Black people are subjects of invidious racial discrimination when it comes to police action. So, walking down the street, you have a Black person who's, let's say, 20 years old. You have a white person who's 20 years old. And let's make them men. Both just walking down the street. And question, attitude of the police towards these two. An attitude, is a complicated thing. It can show itself in various ways. It can show itself in a look. It can show itself in who gets the look. Black person's, walking down the street or running down the street. White person's walking down the street or running down the street. What happens with respect to the police? Let's suppose that, who gets the second look? Who is followed? Who is detained for a moment?
Well, some of it is just on a small tangent. I apologize to interrupt, but attitude is an interesting one because a lot of the interaction doesn't show up in the data. So detained, for example, starts showing up in the data. But before then, the second look, the third look, the first look, this is where the gray area of conversation happens because
very much so.
Culture and society happens in the stuff that doesn't often show up in the data.
Yep. So I tell you, this really came home to me several years ago. I was in New York City, and it was at a time when there was a lot of discussion over the
stop and frisk,
basically, racial profiling on the street. I was walking. I was in Harlem. I'm walking down the street, And frankly, the police weren't bothering me. I'm just walking. No, the police weren't bothering me, but I'm of a certain age. I did notice though, I was looking at the police and the way that the police attitude, it had to do with body posture. It had to do with, that's right, who got a second look. It had to, I noticed, I'm walking down the street, I'm walking in Harlem. There are white people in the street. Most of the people though were black, some Hispanic. The level of contempt, the level of animus, the level of unfriendliness that was pouring off the police, they didn't say anything. No, they didn't detain, they didn't say anything. It was palpable. I could feel the attitude that was being directed at the young black men. And the thing is, it's not as if this doesn't matter. It matters because the way I saw it, these young black men knew, they felt the contempt that the police were shedding, and this was going to have a consequence. The consequence it was going to have is, let's imagine that the police did say, excuse me, what are you up to? Now, if you have been feeling this contempt, if you feel like the officer who is asking this question doesn't like you, doesn't know anything about you, but just doesn't like you on sight, you might answer in a certain sort of way. You're not going to give the cop the benefit of the doubt and basically think, well, policeman's just, asking me this, probably just trying to make the neighborhood safe. Well, if that's your feeling, the policeman's just asking me this, trying to make the neighborhood safe. Well, officer, the reason why I'm here is such and such. And, thanks for your service. That's one response. Another response is, I'm not going to tell you anything. I'm not going to tell you anything. I know that you don't mean me any, I know that you don't mean me any good. I'm not going to tell you anything. Am I free to leave? And then the cop, having heard that, then says something bad. After 5 minutes, what do you have? You have an altercation on your hand. And I felt that. And that is part, and you're absolutely right, that's not written down. It doesn't get to court. It's there, but it's an important part of street life. It's an informal part of street
And it
life.
has ripple effects because that young black man will probably talk shit about that cop later that day. So the narrative persists, and then the cop will also talk shit, and then there's these narratives.
Yep.
And I think the contempt is such a powerful thing.
It's so hard to disentangle because you're absolutely right. The young man, let's suppose that the story ends, quote, well.
Right.
He's going to go and he's going to be talking with his friends and he's going to say, let me tell you what just happened to me. And his friends are going to say, oh yeah, that doesn't surprise me. Let me tell you what happened to me. And, for 2 hours, this goes on. The anger, the feeling of humiliation, the feeling of aggrievement grows. It's disseminated. And that's part of what we have. But that's not all of, that's an important part of what we have, but it's even worse than that, because then you ask the question, what about things we do know? I know this from my teaching. This was brought up. There was a lawsuit in New York City, And notice I didn't say, I didn't say Birmingham, Alabama. I didn't say Atlanta, Georgia. I didn't say Tallahassee, Florida. I didn't say, the Deep South. I didn't say Montana. I didn't say Idaho. New York City. Cosmopolitan place, metropolis. In New York City, the police were challenged with respect to their policies. A judge wrote a very lengthy opinion, and the facts were rolled out, and the facts were really quite horrifying. There were black men who had been stopped many, many times. It wasn't just once, over and over and over again, under circumstances in which they ought not have been stopped. And, this has real consequences. It doesn't just show up here, though, of course. It also shows up in other places with respect to the administration of justice. And we still have, a big problem. Now, you mentioned, the police. If you ask yourself, who are the state agents that are most consequential? The police. I mean, you walking down the street, what other agents have guns on them? What other agents are authorized by the law to shoot you under certain circumstances? It's the police. The police are the most consequential agents of the state that most people interact with.
I mean, there's to push back a little bit, still of consequential in a physical sense, but if we return to the power of the psychological sense of contempt, I would say store clerks and stuff like that can also be a source of
They're
contempt.
not agents of the state.
Right. But if we look at the landscape of contempt, which throughout the 20th century, or the bus, right, you can experience the same kind of contempt in other aspects of society. But yes, the cops have consequences.
I would still put the policeman or the police person is a person walking down the street with a gun.
Yeah.
And if you think about the way in which the law, the extent to which the police are authorized to use their force, the police have extraordinary authority.
Mm-hmm.
You're driving your car and you're speeding. The police can arrest you right then and there and take you to jail. That's an extraordinary power.
But they also have, because of that, the leverage, just one human to another, they have more leverage to be an asshole and to show contempt to you.
They certainly do.
To be the lesser, to lean into the lesser aspects of their nature, as all humans can, just to be an asshole, to show contempt. You had a bad day. They have the more freedom to do that.
Yes, and that's why police officers are very important. I recognize. I mean, I know police officers. They have a very difficult job, a very important job. Very important. Again, remember what I talked about, underprotection. I want the police to protect me. I want the police to protect me from the rapist, the robber. So the police, I'm with the police. We need good policing. But we need good policing. And for good policing, we need accountability. And one of the just absolute scandals of American law is the extent to which the police are not held accountable. It's absolutely remarkable, the degree to which American law fails to properly hold police accountable. They have an important job, a difficult job. I want them to be very well paid. As far as I'm concerned, police should make more money. They should be given the importance of what they do. They should have more respect more prestige, more money. With all of that, they should be held accountable. And the way things are now, they're not held accountable. And every day we see the consequences in our newspapers or just, talking with people.
So, what do you make of the different perspective on this? From to bring up a person that I'll probably speak with, Heather McDonald,
Mm-hmm.
who wrote a book called War on Cops, and will often bring up the stuff that does show up in the data to show the disproportionate amount of homicides committed by African Americans. And will also justify racial profiling on that basis in stop and frisk programs. And we'll also bring up things like the Ferguson effect, saying that because of this pushback and all the stuff we've been saying about police, in those areas, the police will step back and crime will increase.
I was in one debate with her. And one of the things that I said is, it was a debate that was sponsored by the Federalist Society, conservative legal group. These were conservative law students at Harvard Law School. She made a presentation and they asked me to respond. And one of the things that I said was, when we're talking about the police, I'm disappointed with the reaction of some of my conservative colleagues, and I would consider her to be one of my conservative colleagues, because what are some of the important precepts of conservatives? One very important precept of conservatives: limited government. Limited government. What do conservatives talk about? The tendency of government to overreach itself and governmental agents to overreach themselves. And I say, you're right. You're right. Right on. Why is it that you somehow forget that when you're talking about the police? When you're talking about the police, you seem to be unaware of this tendency that is so much in your consciousness and other places. But now, when you're talking about the police, you make it seem as though other people are being paranoid when they talk about the danger of overreach. We need to be very careful about the danger of overreach. Another thing with respect to the police, what do conservatives? Transparency in government. You're right. You're absolutely right. We need transparency in government. So why is it that so often when we're talking about policing, why is it that conservatives actually embrace police unions and are the enemies of transparency? Why is it that you want to prevent the citizenry from knowing that officer so-and-so has, there have been 10 incidents in the last year in which citizens have complained about officer so-and-so? Don't you think that the citizenry ought to know that? Why is it that you want to keep that under wraps? So overreach, transparency, the tendency or the problem of governmental agent corruption. Why is it that those sorts of things are forgotten about when some conservatives, by the way, not all conservatives, there's some conservatives who have stuck, and appropriately so, to their guns and have said, hey, we need to make sure that the police stay in their lane. We need to make sure that the police do not overstep constitutional bounds. We need to insist on transparency. There are some conservatives who have taken that line, and I salute them. But there are a lot of conservatives, and I would say Heather McDonald was one of them, who all of a sudden become just, totally uncritical statists when they're talking about the police.
So the overstepping, the overreach, the lack of transparency. Of course, we see this kind of stuff in foreign policy as well, which is starting military conflicts, and a lot of the supporters, at least with the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, were conservatives and hawks and so on. So there's a lot of hypocrisy in terms of principles and so on. But maybe one question is, in this discussion about racism and policing, there was a lot of cops that might listen to this and feel like their profession is not being respected. They're not being heard, not being respected to the difficulty of the problem they're facing. And
can I just interject?
Yes,
Remember a few moments ago. I mean, if I were in charge of things, I'd pay police more. In fact, much more than they receive. Police have a very difficult job, extraordinarily difficult job. I mean, for one thing, sort of maintaining the law. The law, that's a very complicated thing, the law. That's not an easy thing. I mean, I teach law. I spend a lot of hours with very smart people trying to understand the law. Very difficult. So here we expect people to understand the law at the same time that they are grappling with people, some of whom are violent. It's very difficult. I respect police officers. And I said, we need police officers. You did not hear me say, by the way, so let's get down to brass tacks. You did not hear me say, defund the police, did you? In fact, to the contrary, I said, defund. Actually, I want more funds for the police. I want to hold them accountable. I understand the difficulty of their job. I respect the police. I want people to respect the police. I also want the police to respect civilians and demand that they do. I am not a police abolitionist. Far from it. Far from it. Again, we need good policing. For good policing, we need good people.
To what degree, it's almost philosophically, maybe practically, do you think police should be doing racial profiling? Profiling in general.
Okay.
It's a very difficult philosophical, moral, human question.
Yeah. So first thing we need to do, and here we get back to the early part of our conversation, because we focus so much on first part of a word. Here we have another word, profiling. Question: what is racial profiling? Now, here we have in the weeds, we have people talking past one another. I've been in conversations with police officers in debates, and we talk past one another because we are defining racial profiling very differently. If you ask, I've been in conversations with police officers, and they say, "Oh, I'm totally against racial profiling." And then I say, "Well, sir, what do you mean by racial profiling?" And here's what they say. Racial profiling is when police officers act against somebody wholly on the basis of race. That gets rid of the issue, because, most police officers don't act against anyone wholly on the basis of race. You could have the most racist police officer, and that police officer is not going to act adversely against the 90-year-old black woman walking down the street with a cane. Okay. So it's always, so they're, if you define racial profiling that way, you're getting rid of the issue. The proper issue is this: should the police be able to act against someone taking race into account as a factor? So let's imagine that a black person who's 25 years old is walking down the street right next to a white person who's 25 years old. Some people would say, you know what? Under those circumstances, it's okay for the police officer to give 2 looks at the black person and only 1 look at the white person. Why? Because the statistics tell us that the black 25-year-old, there's much more risk of that person acting in an unlawful way. If you take a look at, crime statistics and ask the question, with respect to, homicide, with respect to robbery, with respect to various, crimes, what is there a difference between the white 25-year-old and the black 25-year-old? With respect to certain crimes, the answer is, in certain places, the answer is, yeah, there is a difference. And there is a greater risk that the black 25-year-old has engaged in various forms of criminality. I'm not, okay. Under those circumstances, what do I say? Should the police officer therefore be allowed to take action vis-a-vis the black person as against the white person? My answer is no. I'm fully willing to concede. Let's concede for the point of discussion that there is more risk. There might be. But for reasons of constructing the sort of society I want, we should not empower agents of the state to act towards certain people in a way that's, adverse to them. Let me try to break this down in a little different way. Let's go back to let's talk about what happens when you want to get on an airplane. It wasn't so long. 9/11 wasn't all that long ago. It was a while ago, but it wasn't all that long ago. And this very issue came up with respect to the profiling of Muslims. And there were some people who said, well, geez, in the aftermath of 9/11, profiling of Muslims makes sense. No hard feelings, but, the 11 people who, were on those planes were all Muslims. Now, there is a rationale. You could just simply say it's not prejudice, it's not animus, it's not invidious, it's just, the facts take us this way. Well, the facts never take us this way. There are facts, and then there is our choice of how we want to respond to those facts. Now, you could respond by saying, well, we perceive Muslims to be more likely to, do bad things on an airliner. You could respond in that way. On the other hand, you could say, no, we want a society in which people do not have to grapple with prejudice on the basis of their religion, or on the basis of their race. And to deal with that, we're going to demand that agents of the state act towards people in the same way. And so if that means that everybody getting on the airplane, before they get on the airplane, has to, open up their luggage, and it slows things down, but everybody has to open up their luggage, I would prefer that over a system in which we focus on people who are Muslim. And one of the reasons, and I'm going to bring this back to the racial thing. One of the reasons why I want to insist upon that is because if we all have to open up our luggage, what that means is we're all paying a tax for more security. And we're all likely to ask ourselves, do we want to pay this tax? Whereas if we focus simply on the Muslims and allow the Muslims to be the only ones who are sort of paying the tax, we'll foist that on them. Same in the, black person, white person, 25 years old, walking down the street. Do we want to impose a racial tax on the black 25-year-old? Some people would say yes. I say that's a mistake. Black people aren't stupid. They know that they're paying this tax. It is a violation of, it seems to me, the rules that we ought to want to have to govern our society. I say spread the costs, make the police deal with everybody the same, and don't allow a situation to develop in which a group of people can accurately say, we are paying more of a cost than these other people over here.
So it's a better avoiding profile is, while it may have costs on security in the short term, in the long term, it's the embodiment of the principles that all men are created equal. So it has a much bigger benefit.
Yes,
in representing the fairness.
Yes,
that is at the core of the ideals of this country.
Yes,